All right, not the conclusions from the evidence. If you look at the evidence, you see that that doesn't make any sense at all. In fact, the evidence is overwhelming. It's not even a question of, well, where's the preponderance of the evidence? There really is no evidence that, in this particular case, Tukhachevsky and the other military commanders were innocent. All of the evidence is that they were guilty. We even have, and I talk about some of it in this book, in chapter 17. We even have evidence from outside the Soviet Union, all right, that the Soviets couldn't have had any influence on about Tukhachevsky's guilt. So if you look at the evidence.
Is that the Czechoslovakia stuff?
Yeah.
Well, that's more fabricated than anything else.
That's some of it. And no, but again, you have to ask what the evidence is. So we have a great deal of evidence of that the military commanders were guilty. We don't have any evidence that they were innocent. So if you go by the evidence, you have to conclude that they were guilty. Now, my book doesn't only deals with the Tukhachevsky issue by way of discussing some of the evidence having to do with the Kirov affair, but it's in there, and it's very interesting. The specific case, and then I want to pass on to somebody else. In chapter 17, I go into is this NKVD general named Genrikh Yushkov, who defected to the Japanese in 1938. And he wrote some political propaganda for the Japanese, blaming, saying Stalin had framed everybody about everything. But an American scholar who knew Russian and Japanese, and who died, this is now dead, not deceased, a guy named Alvin Kooks, spent many years of his life in Japan tracking down and interviewing the Japanese military handlers, the people who had dealt with Yushkov. He found some of his documents and he interviewed these people. And they all said that Yushkov told them about all these conspiracies that really were going on in the Soviet Union. So he told them about them privately. Now, of course, publicly he wrote that there were no conspiracies. But he told these officers privately that there were, and he enumerated who was doing them and so forth, right? So that's a part of the evidence that has to do with the military conspiracy that also has to do with the Kirov conspiracy, because Lushkov also talked about that to some extent. That's why there's a chapter in this particular book. To go more into the question of the Tukhachevsky conspiracy would be sort of a little beside the point, or we could do that afterwards maybe if you have some time, because there's a lot more evidence about the Tukhachevsky conspiracy. I mean, there's so much evidence.
Well, thank you very much.
Yeah, sure. One more thing maybe, just as an example. Some years ago, probably 10 years ago now, I wrote a review. It's a long, detailed review of a book on the Spanish Civil War, edited by a guy named Ronald Radosh. Some of you probably know who he is. He's I guess many years ago he was a communist, or he was certainly on the left, and then he became a super right-wing anti-communist, right? And he wrote this book called Spain Betrayed, which came out in 2001, I think, and I published a review on it in 2003. When I read that book, I had sort of anticipated that book, It's a book of documents with his commentary. And it's a sort of schizophrenic work, because you read the documents, and they're very interesting, primary source documents, and then you read his commentary, and his commentary is false. I mean, he's just wrong. It just doesn't make any sense, right? You have the documents, and then he says they say one thing, and the documents actually don't say that at all. So, I wrote this review saying, this is a very interesting book. If you forget about what Radosh says, and you just read the documents, they're very interesting documents. And if you read them both, you read the documents and you see what Radosh says, then you get an insight into the extent to which mainstream historiography of the communist movement is just completely dishonest. And it's not just Radosh, it's all of these people. I spent 5 or 6 chapters of this book just discussing in detail the 3 major studies of the Kirov assassination. They're all very recent. Just because any sensible person would say, well, why should we read Furr? We have these other 3 books, and they all say, they're all famous people, right? Full professors here and there, right? All around the world. You know, and then who the hell are you? So why should we believe them and believe me? Well, of course, you shouldn't go around believing people. Truth or falsehood is decided on questions of evidence. So I had to take each of these studies and go through and show how each of them distorts, or even in some cases just falsify, the evidence that they're discussing. All right? I had to critique them, and that's what I did. So that is the case with the Tukhachevsky affair, too. I would go so far as to say you will not read an honest study of the military purges. There simply isn't one in print. Okay? And when mine comes out, that'll be some years from now, then there'll be one. But this isn't because I'm so brilliant. This is because there really is no field of Soviet studies in the world. There isn't. There's a field of anti-communist Soviet studies. And if you don't come to an anti-communist, anti-Stalin conclusion, you can't get published. Right. 6 or 8 months ago, whatever it was, when this book was still in, it was basically finished. But, you know, I wanted to get some blurbs. You know, it's always nice to have some blurbs in the back of the book, right? Somebody famous to say what a wonderful guy you are. I wasn't successful in that. But I did send the book around, send the manuscript around, and I sent it to one American historian who I have a tremendous amount of respect for. He's not a leftist at all, but he's a very honest guy. He spent his whole life writing about the famine of 1932-33. He's the world's greatest expert on that famine. Yeah. If you're familiar with this field, you'll know who I'm talking about, but I don't want to mention his name, get involved personally. And I sent it to him because I'm in good terms with him. And he read the book. He had 1 or 2 very, very minor points. You know, basically talk about me a little further up because you really should. And it's true, I really should. And so I changed that. And then he sent me this long letter, very helpful. I spent a lot of time on it, saying, Grover, you really got to say some bad stuff about Stalin. You really have to. You're just not going to have any credibility. You have this reputation as a Stalinist, as somebody who denies the Katyn massacre. You know, in other words, you're nuts, right? You've really got to put in some anti-Stalin stuff. And then he said, well, you know, Stalin really was a bad guy. And he started ticking off all of these things, none of which are true, of course. But, I mean, just not to do him any disrespect. But, you know, he wanted my book to be successful. And he said, you know, to be successful, you got to be able to find a publisher. Nobody's going to pay any attention to you unless you say some bad stuff about Stalin. That's the way it is. Okay? That's the way it is. That's why I published with this tiny little publisher. He's a great guy, but nobody had ever heard of it, you know, Erythros Press. It's very hard. There is no field of Soviet studies. There's only anti-communist Soviet studies. That's the reality. I got an email after I left, because, you know, I can get some emails on this little phone, but I can't really write very much on it. I got an email from some young man, and he said, I want you to explain to me how come, I've read your book, I don't know if he really read the book, but he says he read the book. He says, I want you to explain to me why, you know, X, Y, and Z, these other famous Sovietologists, Soviet historians, all disagree with you. All disagree with you. When I get back, I'm going to tell them what I just told you. I said, because you can't be a professional student of Soviet history and have a position in a university and have a career and so forth and so on without being an anti-communist. It's not possible. It isn't possible. You can't do it. Okay? That's the facts. Okay? So this is what's going on. You had your hand up then, John, and then this gentleman here, and then back there.
No?
Yeah. Didn't you have your hand up?
Yeah. Well, I have one clarification to make, and then also a point on it. What you're saying about the Katyn massacre is that these people were shipped to a certain camp, supposed to have been shot there, but then wound up dead a year or so later in a different camp? Is that
briefly, all of the Polish prisoners were the prison camps of the Polish officers still in Soviet captivity. They let all the enlisted men go. They let them all go. And some stayed in the Soviet Union, some of them went back to German-occupied Poland, you know, because there was no Poland anymore. Who knows what happened to them? They kept the officers. Those camps were all closed, and those prisoners were all shipped out. 100 at a time. in April, May 1940. And we have all of the transit lists. They're all in Russian, of course, but I mean, you know, the Soviet government under Gorbachev gave them to the Poles, and the Poles published them. So there's no evidence in those transit lists that these people were sent to be shot. And in fact, one of those documents actually says, send them to labor camps. Okay? So that's an assumption in this whole mountain of discussion about the Katyn massacre. That's assumed that they were all shot by the Soviets. That plus the fact that Gorbachev said that they were all shot. Of course, Gorbachev's one of the world-class anti-communists, right? I mean, but you know, should realize that. So the fact that these two guys, all right, Kuligovsky and Malovsky happen to be their names, but these two guys were just two of the 14,000 or so Polish officers who were shipped out of these camps in April and May 1940. Were not shot and buried where they were said to be shot and buried, but actually were shot and buried by the Germans sometime after August 1941, 800 miles away from where they're supposed to be shot and buried, is the evidence that there's no evidence that any of these people, therefore, were shot and buried where they are. By the way, there are, on the internet, I could send them out, I guess I'll put them on my website, there are monuments. There are big-time monuments to the victims of the Katyn massacre. And there are monuments to each of Kuligovsky and Malovsky and all of the other 14,000 people, you know, at the places where they are said to be buried. But they're not buried there. And probably none of the rest of them are buried there either. There are, the Polish government has probably spent $100 million on monuments to the victims of the Katyn massacre. They're all over the country. I'm saying nothing about books and internet pages and so forth. In a way, that's nothing. I mean, the Russians have also, of course, the Russian government also agrees with this. So they probably spent another $100 million on monuments to the Katyn victims of Katyn massacres in Russia. You probably remember, you may remember that in 2010, a plane full of Polish diplomats, including the president of Poland, were all killed when their plane crashed into Smolensk Airport, or approaching the Smolensk Airport, as they were on their way to yet another commemoration of the Katyn massacre, right? It was, when that happened, I was on a Russian discuss list run here in the United States, and everybody was saying, oh, what a tragedy. And I took, like an idiot, I posted this thing and I said, well, you know, what's the tragedy here? I mean, who are these people? You know, they're the reactionary politicians and so forth. I got kicked off the list. Boom. You know, that's just off. You're off. You're history, buddy. We're not going to have you on this list. You know.
How'd you get on it in the first place?
What?
How'd you get on it in the first place?
Because it's Russian history. That's another issue. You know, if you're going to get on a Russian list, it's going to mean being mainly anti-communist. That's just the way it is. But anyway, you can't. But in a certain sense, we ain't seen nothing yet. There is some evidence, although it's fabricated evidence, we can see that now, but there is some evidence, fabricated though it be, that the Soviets shot some of these prisoners, some of these Polish prisoners, right? It may be a castle built on sand, but at least there's some sand, okay? There is no evidence, not a shred, that the famine of 1932-33 was deliberate starvation of the Ukrainians. Nothing. And I have it. It's an article by a Canadian-Ukrainian researcher, not an anti-communist, but he happens to be an anti-nationalist Ukrainian researcher. You know, that takes guts, frankly. Who just said the other day that there are 1,400 monuments to the victims of the Holodomor, you know, the deliberate starvation of Ukrainians, in today's Ukraine. That's what he said, 1,400 monuments. All right? Now, people did die. There's no question. It was a famine, right? But they're not monuments to people who died in a famine. By the way, there were lots of other famines, too. They're monuments to the evils of communism, right? Because Stalin deliberately starved all these people. 1,400 monuments, and it never happened. It never happened. This is what we're facing here.
I was just going to make the
Yeah.
comment
Yeah.
on the point of A while back, I read a book about life and terror in this.
Yeah.
I forget the exact name of the title. Life and Terror under Stalin, 1936 to 38.
Robert Thurston.
Thurston.
Yes,
Absolutely.
it's terrible.
When the book came out,
Yes.
I just remember reading every chapter saying, you know, Stalin was this monster. He did, oh, wow, he's just a bad guy. But he didn't do this. And he went through about 10 things that he didn't do.
Yeah.
And part of the thing after a while is, so then why do you give some substantiation to why you said that. But the real thing, to go to the point you're making, is I read a review of that book in the New York Times review.
Oh, yeah, I remember that.
And it was juxtaposed with another book, because they always kind of link them up, about Stalin. It was
Edward Rodzinski's biography of Stalin.
right, the psychological thing. And in the thing, in the review, they made a clear point that this book by Thurston, that came, I think, under Yale University Press, was really dangerous. Even though he went in the archives and he found all this stuff, it's so factual, and it's got this stamp of approval from Yale University Press. But this book it's tantamount to Holocaust denial. The other book, and they pointed out, well, the guy did get Lenin's birthday wrong and stuff like this.
Yeah.
But this is really a good book.
Yeah,
And it was so obvious even by the reviewer saying, well, how can you say historically this is a good book and it's just a psychological profile, and this other book that has all this evidence to it is really a disaster. The only reason you could say that is because it didn't fit the paradigm. So that's it. And putting yourself in that category then means, like you said, you can't publish anything without
that's right.
that being, it's Holocaust denial.
Yeah. Thurston's, I don't want to go into all the long thing about it, but I've been in touch with Thurston for many years. Thurston who wrote that book. And I have the notes to his book in my office. I asked him for that some years ago. He said, here, ship it to me. Then there's more to say about Thurston. He's a great guy who recently retired. But I sent out a notice when this book was published at the beginning of June. I sent out a notice to lots of people saying, the book's been published. And one of the first emails I got back was from Bob Thurston. He says, Greg Grover, I'm ordering a book for the Indiana, I think he teaches at Indiana University of Ohio. I'm ordering a book for our library. So he's a really good guy. But he's out of the field. The negative response to that book of his contributed heavily to the fact that the last 20 years of his, certainly the last from 97 or 98 on, he wrote nothing else on Soviet history. He turned to writing about other things. He wrote a very interesting book on the witch craze of the 17th century, 16th, 17th century in Europe, and some other interesting stuff. But he got right out of the field of Soviet stuff. And I asked him years ago, was it because of the negative response to your book? And he said, well, that was a big part of it. So that's right. And he's another person who can attest to what I was saying. This is a super anti-communist field. You just you can't overlook that. That's why you haven't read about this stuff. And you won't. That's
okay. I think it's an error to conflate Kirov assassination with Katyn Forest. I'm a Trotskyist.
Sure.
When I joined the Trotskyists, I am what I consider Trotskyist. There are Trotskyite elements that I consider counter-revolutionary.
Yes.
I don't know what they consider me, that's their problem. I read originally in our material that it was Goebbels' propaganda on Katyn, that it was a German massacre. The only thing I ever read different than that in the Trotskyist movement, that even if it happened to be proven that the Soviet Union killed these officers, there's no question these were counter-revolutionary officers that had murdered the working class in Poland in the uprising during the, was that Horthy? The guy in between, before Pilsudski.
Yes.
That Pilsudski, these were Pilsudski officers that crushed and murdered workers' demonstrations, but they never said that the Soviet Union did that. Now, so my critique so far is that it would seem to me, and I'd like to finish before you interpose your remarks. So
certainly,
I definitely want to hear from you. And I don't
certainly, absolutely.
That there is no revolutionary, from what I gather from you, there is no revolutionary Marxist way of critiquing Stalinism that doesn't fall in prey to anti-communism? I believe there is. Okay. So what I would like, I'll drop that, but what I'd like you to do is show me a corroborative document of this military conspiracy, which was ostensibly, given the executions, some were connected to British spies, some Japanese, and some German. So let's say if the left and the right opposition even were connected to decapitating the Soviet Union in league with the Nazis, which is what I heard when I was a member of the Communist Party's Labor Youth League, then I would like to see a corroborative document from German files. I'll tell you why. Soviet intelligence captured Operation Barbarossa, top secret, showing the disposition of forces, the number of divisions, and even the date of the assault. Sword spy ring, the Red Orchestra got it, even the Lucy spy ring got this. I have never seen a single document that connects the Trotskyists to the Nazis, Japanese, or British imperialism. That's number one. And so I'd like to see that. I don't want just your opinion.
You said Trotsky, not the Trotskyists.
And then I'd like to just make an amendment that to link Trotsky and Zinoviev. The Zinoviev and Kamenev worked with Stalin before they fled and unfortunately were led into the left opposition, which they soon betrayed, crawled back on their hands and knees, capitulated, then they were kicked out again, then they recapitulated, and Trotsky thought them very pathetic creatures, but certainly not terrorists. That was his analysis of them. I would like, other than confessions, because confessions are not primary evidence.
Sure they are.
Not to me. Not to me. Because I've seen confessions by police in this country, and so I want some documentation. Even Vyshinsky even said, we don't need documentation because in such a conspiracy there is none. That's bullshit. We found the documents of the Zionist collusion with the Nazis. We found the collusion between the American industrialists after the declaration of war with the Nazis, both in Nazi archives and in U.S. archives, both in Palestine and in Nazi archives. There's not a single document that I know of corroborating what you're saying. And if there is, I am fascinated. I'd love to be able to return to my roots. My uncle was a member of the Communist Party. My first work was in the Rosenberg Defense Committee, which I personally feel the Communist Party sabotaged their defense. So I would love to, oh boy, my whole adult life has been a waste. Now I can go back to my youthful ideas of Stalinism.
I'm not trying to
show
recruit
me,
you.
buddy. Show me.
I'm not trying to recruit you to
Read
anything.
Elgin. Read
What?
Elgin. He
Oh,
explains it all.
Yeah,
Okay,
right.
okay,
Yeah,
just
you like Sayers and
one thing again. Let's not
Someone
get
sell
into
it.
it. Yeah, so just shut it off if you can. I'm not 100% sure of exactly what you're asking me, but let me see if I can answer a little part of it. That's probably all I've got a chance to do here. As I mentioned before, in 1980, the Harvard Trotsky archives were opened.
And tell me the documents. I'm going to look them up. Let me tell you. You got something on that, I want to see it.
Yeah, well, there's quite a bit. And the first people, as you can imagine, who were into the Trotsky archives were Trotskyists. And specifically, Pierre Brouet, who died in 2006, the most famous Trotskyist historian of his time, had a team of a few French, maybe graduate students, I'm not sure exactly what their status was. They went into the archives and they started to make discoveries. And the first thing they discovered, or that they published, was right away in 1980, or early 81, was that there was a block of rights in Trotsky. But Trotsky lied about all that stuff publicly, because there was a block of rights in Trotsky. And he published, this has been out for 30-something years now, it's 1980, right? So, Brouet to make a fast forward a little bit, Brouet published a biography of Trotsky in 1987. It was available online in French anyway. There you go. After that, however, he continued to make more discoveries of specific incidents where Trotsky lied to the Dewey Commission and lied in his public publications, to the Bulletin of the Opposition and so forth about some of this stuff. So Brouet didn't interpret them. You know, Brouet had a sort of apologetic approach, but he found this material, and it's very interesting and valuable. Others have also, not necessarily myself here, others have also studied Trotsky's statements at one time or another during the 1930s about the trials, and found, for example, that he found further lies, further falsifications. We know, for example, that Trotsky was in touch with Radek and Sokolnikov, that they did not really capitulate. They pretended to capitulate. Brouet writes about that in one of his articles. You know, these were not real capitulations, and everybody knew they weren't. Well, obviously not everybody knew, but he thought that everybody knew that this was just a tactic. So the fact that Radek was attacking Trotsky in Soviet publications and Trotsky was attacking Radek, we can now see was a smokescreen for the fact that they actually were in alliance, because we have evidence of that now. So there are a number of issues like that. And enough, I believe, for a book-length study. So that's my current project, is to write that book-length study. A couple of years ago, I wrote an article, a long article, called "The Evidence of Leon Trotsky's Conspiracy with the Soviets, with the Germans and Japanese," and that's on Cultural Logic. It's available online. But there's a lot more. There's a lot more, and so and last year, I haven't published this. I guess I'll save it for the book. But last year, at a couple of conferences, I gave a paper about this. In the process of doing this research on the Kirov assassination, I, of course, studied what Trotsky said about the Kirov assassination in the Bulletin of the Opposition. He wrote about it extensively. And Trotsky did not have access to Soviet research, Bestia and Pravda. They were very hard to get in France, and it took a long time to get them, and he was kind of under surveillance anyway. So he used the French Communist Party newspaper, L'Humanité, which was widely available and which had correspondence in Moscow, and whatever appeared in the Soviet press, you know, the L'Humanité correspondents summarized it all and put it in L'Humanité and said it, you know, and it was published like the next day or the day after that. So he used that material and wrote about the Kirov and ridiculed the accusations that were coming out of Moscow on the basis of this material. So what I did was, it's nothing terribly clever, I just said, okay, well, let me get those articles from L'Humanité. L'Humanité is available, you know, these things are on microfilm, you can go and get it. So I got it, and got the articles that Trotsky specifically was using as his sources. He said, this is the article that I'm using. And what I found out is that Trotsky was lying about what was in those articles. That stuff wasn't in those articles at all. It was pretty amazing. If anybody at the time had done what I did, gotten the Humanité, which obviously was much easier to get in those days, you know, a contemporary issue, and then taken a look at what Trotsky was writing in the Bulletin of the Opposition, anybody could have seen that this was false. He was distorting and lying about what was in these articles. I don't know, I guess shocked is too strong a word, but I was more than mildly surprised. And that's the story. So something's going on, and that's very interesting to me. And so I'm going to write about that. But just as a final point here, the question arises, who was reading the Bulletin of the Opposition in the mid-1930s? Who was reading this? Not many people were reading it. I know the NKVD was reading it, but aside from them, they weren't the intended audience. It was Trotsky supporters mainly who were reading